Hello and welcome to the Guitar Learning Show. I'm Bob.
And I'm Kevin. And today we're going to talk to you about ways to improve your chord changes. This video is going to be directed mostly towards beginners that are having struggles with changing chords in the open position, aka cowboy chords. So we have a few different techniques that we've learned over our guitar journey at this point that we think will be helpful to you. And if you stick around till the end, we're going to go over some music trivia that I think you'll find interesting.
So the first thing we want to do when we change chords is we want to take a look at the proper way to change chords. So there is a proper way, and the proper way is to have, let's say, all your fingers placed. So we have a G chord here. We have all your fingers placed. And then you lift up and you change the fingers in the air and set them all down at the same time. So G to C. This is tricky. This takes a lot of repetition. And we've no matter where you are in your guitar journey, you've learned that you have to develop a very high tolerance for repetition if you're going to be a musician. But that takes a lot of practice, and you have to work that into your practice routine and make it part of your practice routine. But you can't, what's the expression, let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If you are going to wait until you can change chords perfectly every time, it's going to take a long time before you reach the point where you can play songs. And we became musicians to play songs. None of us wanted to pick up the guitar to run scales and learn modes. We want to play songs. And so that's why today we want to talk about some call them tricks, hacks, techniques, things you can do to get to playing songs faster. So one of the techniques is anchor fingers. And Kevin's going to walk us through how to use anchor fingers.
Okay, so when you're playing the open chords, there's several chords that you can switch between using anchor fingers. And an anchor finger is essentially a finger that's shared by two different chords, or maybe even three different chords. But two different chords. And I would like to begin with the big G chord. So the big G, where you have your pinky on the high E string, you've got your ring finger on the B string, and then up here on the low strings, you've got your index on the A and your middle finger on the E. And so I say that's the big G because you're playing all six strings, and you've got a couple of open strings in there that really help it to ring out quite a bit. So I like to switch between the G chord and the D chord, and there's a lot of songs that you can play that will do this. So essentially, you're going to take your index and your ring from the G position and just move it down and play it with you're going to use your middle finger and play the high E string and your index finger to play the G string. And then, of course, you're going to lift your pinky up, and that's going to give you your D chord. And, of course, that's your open D chord. So we begin at the G. And then move down to the D. It really helps having those fingers anchored, especially going back to that G chord, because that G chord is always kind of a challenge to get all four of those fingers, put together in the air and then down at one time, which would be the goal. But right now we'd like to just be able to switch chords and play some songs. So the next chord I would like to talk about is the D to D minor. And I recently discovered this on my own playing the song In My Life by the Beatles. There's a part in the song where they're going from D over to D minor. And I mean, the way I learned this initially was you go from the D and you lift your fingers and then you play the D minor. And of course, that requires a lot of repetition to get to where you can lift those fingers from the D shape and then play the D minor shape. And of course, back to the D shape. So again, what we would do is we'll use the ring finger as your anchor this time, and you just leave the ring finger planted on that B string. And all I did was I lifted my index and I put the index on the high E string, and I took my middle finger and put that on the G string. And I have a D minor. And of course you can still play that open D, and it just gives you a bigger sounding D minor chord. Or you could play it just the three strings, the three notes, and just have the D minor. And that's that one. And then the next one would be going from a C major chord and then going to the A minor. And so that's a little tricky if you're just playing the chord and then lifting all your fingers again to put them all down. Probably not quite as tricky as going from a D chord to a big G chord, but with this chord, you essentially have two potential anchor fingers. You have your index, which is down here on the B string, and then you have your middle finger, which is on the D string. So you can leave those two fingers down if you like, and go from the C to the E minor. Now, I like to make things a little bit harder on myself. It's just the way I'm built. And I learned this going, play the C, and then I would lift my ring and my middle and plant them down to make my A minor chord. So that's another quick way of making those chord changes. And it takes a little practice to get that down. However, that's still a little bit faster than lifting all four fingers up and making the change. Now we're going to look at G to E minor. And I'll begin by playing a big G. And for this one, our anchor finger is going to be the index. So you would leave that index down and lift up the pinky and the ring, and then place the middle finger, move it from the low E string, and then place it down on the D string. And of course, that gives you your E minor chord. Now, when I was first learning to play guitar, for some crazy reason, I learned how to play it, and I don't think this is any of my instructor's fault. I think this was just me, but I started playing my E minor like that, which was with my my middle finger on the A string and my ring finger down on the D. And so that makes it a little bit harder to make this change too. But now, I still like to lift my index finger, just to tell you, that's just how I play. I've gotten used to that over the years. However, that would be kind of a neat trick of making that change. That is a neat trick for making that change, if you could incorporate that. So let's move on to making the change from E minor to A minor.
Yeah.
I think I may have realized something in my own playing. I'll tell everybody.
Okay.
Okay, so the next change we're going to look at is E minor to A minor. Now, I have to tell you, there isn't really an anchor finger on this one, but this is most likely where I started playing E minor with the middle finger and the ring finger instead of the index and the middle. The reason I would do this is because you could very quickly go from the E minor, move those two fingers, each of them down one string, while you plant your index down on the B string. And now you have your A minor. So it's not really an anchor finger type of change, but it's more of a, how are you fingering the E minor for this particular chord change? And for certain songs, you might want to use the ring and the middle finger for the E minor, and for other songs, you might want to use the index and the middle finger. It probably depends upon what chords you're playing with the E minor. So in this case, E minor, so just E minor to A minor. It's pretty quick and easy. Takes a little repetition to not ring out any of the, or to not mute strings you don't want to mute. And then the last change I want to talk about is going from a C major chord to an F major chord. So we're going to use the small F major, the non-full bar. Like that, of course, is a full bar F major chord, and I personally struggle with getting that chord because my fingers are short and I just don't have a lot of room to move. And so to make a change from, say, a C chord to that big F, I guess it's not so bad, but going from some other chords, it's a little bit challenging. So I have learned to use a kind of a mini bar chord, a small F chord, as I like to call it. And basically, you're playing the F chord exactly the way you would as an F bar, except you're not playing the low E string. You're not playing this F note on the low E string. Instead, you're catching the F note down here on the high E string. So the fingering is almost the same, except you're going to do a mini bar down here at the bottom with your B string and your high E string. So you're going to do that. So this chord sounds like this. And then playing the chord that way makes it pretty simple to go from a C to the F. And essentially all you're doing is you are, to go from the C, you're going to plant your pinky down on the D string, and you're going to move your middle from the D down to the G, still on the second fret. And then you're just going to do that mini bar, like I said, with the index and the index finger on the B and the high E strings. And that's what I have for anchor fingers, for at least for this section, for the cowboy chords, for the open chords. And I hope those tips will help you out.
So another approach to simplifying your chord changes is to look at alternate voicings of chords. These are different ways to play what are essentially the same chords. They might be a little different from the open chord, cowboy chord that we're used to, but you can use them in the right situation. One of the trickiest transitions for somebody as they're learning their chord changes is to go from a big G chord to the C major chord, because you are moving everything from here to here. There's a lot to it. In fact, this is where I caught myself when we videotaped one of our band practice. Videotape. Does anybody videotape anything?
No.
No. When we recorded one of our band practices. If I had hair, it would be gray, so that explains it. we recorded one of our band practices, and what I caught myself doing when I made the change was I would put my ring and pinky down and then reach over and grab the E string and the A string. The problem with this is the chord starts at the top, right? That's what we want to hear. But when you're doing this, if you reach the point where you strum, you get that. And that's not a G chord. So one of the tricks is to learn, like I said, different ways to play depending on what you are playing to begin with. So one of the great alternatives to this traditional open C chord is what's called a C add 9. Now this is very similar to a C major. It just borrows an extra note from one octave up. But you'll see when you're going from, let's say, G, C, D, which is a very common chord progression, that it becomes very easy. And here's why. So you're in the big G chord. To go to a C add 9, you're going to keep your ring finger and your pinky down, and you are just going to move your index finger and your middle finger down 1 fret. So middle finger is going to be the 3rd fret of the A string instead of the E string, and index finger is going to be the 2nd fret of the D string instead of the A string. And I just have my middle finger touching the high E or the low E to mute it. And that's a C add 9. Now you can see if you're going from G to C, it's a very easy switch to make. And if we look at that G-C-D transition that I mentioned was so common, I've already got my ring finger on the 3rd fret of the B string for my D chord. I use that as my anchor finger. My pinky goes to the 3rd fret of the high E. My index and middle finger go to the 5th and 6th string, or the 5th and 4th string. So that gives us a way to really simplify that chord transition, and being able to just make that substitution will help you in probably literally hundreds of songs. Now I'd like to talk about some variations on the G chord. Right. So we have several ways we can play the big G on its own. The most common way, or one of the most common ways, is middle finger on the 3rd fret of the low E, index finger on the 2nd fret of the A. I'm leaving the D and the G open, and then ring finger on the 3rd fret of the B and pinky on the 3rd fret of the high E. This gives you kind of what some people will call the Wonderwall G, or the Oasis G, and it's a very big sound. There are some variations to that though. You can leave the B open and just move your ring finger down to the 3rd fret of the high E. And that sounds almost identical. There's even a 2-finger version where I am taking my middle finger on the 3rd fret of the low E and my ring finger on the 3rd fret of the high E, and on my with my middle finger I'm just touching the A so that it's muted. And all of those will work for you in terms of a full G chord. But there are some variations, much like there are for any chord, that we can use. And again, look at the variations based on where you're coming from, the chord you're coming from, and the chord you're going to. And you might find easier ways to do things. I will admit that when we were working on a song that went from B minor to G, I found myself playing the B minor bar chord, and then I would actually try to change to the G open chord, as opposed to the easy way of doing it, of just up and over 1. It took me a little bit to realize what I was doing, but so it just to kind of, like I said, what chord are you coming from, what chord are you going to, and pick the variations accordingly. So another option is to go with the triad G. So the triad G is ring finger on the 5th fret of the D, middle finger on the 4th fret of the G, and index finger on the 3rd fret of the B. And I have my index finger curled down just enough to mute the high E. So that gives you, it doesn't sound as full as the big G, but it's still a complete G chord. The last variation I want to talk about is much like the F major 7, we have the G major 7. The G major 7 is you put your index finger on the 2nd fret of the high E, and your middle finger on the 3rd fret of the low E. And again, I'm just have my middle finger down just enough to mute that A. So much like the F major 7 is a little more dissonant than the full F, the G major 7 does the same thing. And you can use those chords. Those chords work very well when you're going to resolve to the major chord or to a major chord, just to create a little tension or a little interest. But again, it kind of comes down to, like I said, where did you come from and where are you going to? And pick the variation that works for that.
So we've now reached the music trivia portion of the show. And I would like to talk about the fabulous, amazing debut album from the band Boston, which came out in 1976. And I remember when this album, when the songs were aired on the radio. And I remember seeing this album, way back then. And I've been looking at this album cover, I'm embarrassed to say, for almost 50 years. And a colleague of mine recently pointed out to me something that I didn't know. She had said, hey, did you know that there's an old rock album that has guitars on the cover? They look like spaceships, but they're actually guitars. And I was thinking, okay, maybe that's ELO, because ELO, they had that kind of theme on, I think, the Out of the Blue album. So at any rate, I didn't realize that it was actually this Boston album. And you can see the outline of the guitar, and you can see the neck of the guitar going away, and the headstock, and the tuning pegs, and then the bridge here, and the whole. I mean, to me, it looks kind of like a Dreadnought acoustic guitar, and all of them are pretty much the same. These, of course, just much smaller, but all these years, I just never realized what I was looking at, which I will now be taking a much closer look at the albums that I have for fear of missing out on something like this.
Well, and I'll admit that you're embarrassed when you found out. I didn't find out until you told me. So yeah, it's and that's just a fantastic first album. If you're aware of any debut rock album that is better than Boston's debut album, please let us know in the comments, because I would definitely like to give it a listen.
Yeah, and please let us know also if you knew about this, didn't know about it. We'd be interested to hear your thoughts. And if we haven't already asked, please like and subscribe.
Thank you.
And that's all we have for today. And we look forward to seeing you in the next video.